Let's head on down to Kentucky and check in with Congressman Andy Barr, Republican from Kentucky. I'm Kevin Cirilli, Chief Washington Correspondent for Bloomberg TV and Radio. Congressman, thanks for being here. Before we talk news of the day, I do want to ask you about something. You are the House Financial Services Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation. You're the ranking member of that subcommittee. I know you do a lot of bipartisan work protecting veterans from financial scams, and this is such a tough time for so many different Americans and for veterans as well, as we're all navigating through this. What can you tell us about how veterans are being protected right now with all of the economic calamity going on?
Well, Kevin, thanks for having me on. And you're right. We are following very closely the work of the Veterans Affairs Department to make sure that our veterans are not victims of scams. There has been an uptick in various financial scams with many fake or false charities advertising for contributions during this downturn. And so we, in particular, are making sure that our veterans have accurate information about legitimate organizations that they can contribute to and help, and those that are fakes and frauds. The other issue that I've been tracking very closely with veterans is making sure that during the shutdown of our economy and the shutdown of our VA system from the standpoint of physical interaction is we don't want that to disrupt their ability to file and process disability claims. And we did see that for a while. Obviously, they had to shut down in-person meetings, but we wanted the access to the online portal to remain available. And so we filed legislation to make sure that the forms, the application forms and the disability benefits questionnaires would stay available online for veterans so that their efforts to apply for disability benefits would not be interrupted as a result of the COVID pandemic.
Andy Barr's on the line. He is a Republican from the state of Kentucky, a congressman. And you also have worked, whenever people think of Kentucky, Congressman, they think of bourbon distilleries. And we've heard all of these great news stories over the past couple of months. And we've interviewed lawmakers about this as well, of distilleries transitioning from what they typically make, bourbon, into hand sanitizer. And you actually immediately jumped on this and wrote legislation that would allow for some of the red tape when they make such a significant supply chain change to be more feasible in the short term so that they could really pitch in and help and not have to be tied up by red tape. Can you tell us about that and give us an update on that?
Sure. I'm so proud of our signature bourbon distilling industry. I represent the Kentucky Bourbon Trail, and when tourism is down, and in fact the trail had to be closed off because of public safety, because of the need for social distancing, and you can't have large crowds and of course, the risk of contamination of the product. So they shut down the tours, but they quickly retooled their facilities and distilleries to make more alcohol available for production of hand sanitizer, which was in serious short supply, still is, especially for the hospitals and the healthcare providers. And so what we did in the CARES Act, which was the largest of the four rescue bills, we exempted alcohol used for hand sanitizer from the federal excise tax, and that created a greater incentive for our distilleries to pitch in and contribute. And they, in many cases, weren't even trying to sell it. They were just trying to give it away and contribute to fight this public health emergency. One problem still remains, though, and that is the FDA, for whatever reason, will not relent during this public health crisis to allow undenatured alcohol to be used, meaning alcohol that's fit for human consumption. They will not allow that to be used in the hand sanitizer, even though in order to make hand sanitizer, you have to put soap in it, which basically makes it inedible and undrinkable. Nevertheless, they are still requiring, the FDA is still requiring what I think is a little excessive bureaucracy and red tape, and that is they're still required to denature it, meaning they have to put in certain oils And so we introduced a bill, Senator Rand Paul in the Senate, and I introduced this in the House to allow for the pendency of the pandemic and the public health crisis to allow them to use undenatured alcohol. We don't think the risk of people consuming that alcohol will be very strong when soap is added and it's used for purposes of hand sanitizer.
Sounds nasty, Congressman. Congressman Andy Barr is on the line, Republican from Kentucky. You mentioned the CARES Act. We've been trying to get our arms around this one. Do you think there's going to be another economic stimulus ahead of the August recess? And if so, what's in it?
There could be, but I will tell you, despite the hand-wringing from some cities and states about a need for a bailout of state and local governments, we've included over $750 billion in relief to states and local governments, and much of it has not even been deployed yet. Many of the healthcare dollars have not yet been deployed. Remember, we have appropriated and borrowed almost $3 trillion, and much of that money has yet to be used. Even the very popular PPP program, the Paycheck Protection Program, we're only at a little north of $500 billion of that allocated, with 660 authorized for that program. And by the way, not a dime of that has been taxpayer money so far, because none of the banks and the private lenders have been reimbursed yet. They will be, because much of this will be forgiven loans. But it's amazing to think the contribution of the private sector and the capital providers, all of this money has come from the private community banks, the regional banks, the larger banks, the credit unions, even the non-bank lenders. They have really stepped into the breach and provided a lot of this liquidity. So at this point, I don't think we have an urgent need for another measure, but there could be one. There is an appetite, bipartisan appetite, for some COVID-related additional relief to state and local governments, but that has to be coupled and combined with liability protection that will really facilitate reopening the economy. And we have to reopen the economy to rebuild the tax base. We can't keep borrowing. We need taxpayers, and that means we need people back to work.
Congressman Andy Barr is on the line. He's a Republican from Kentucky. You mentioned the bipartisanship in certain of these areas, and listeners of this program in particular know that that's what I try to figure out. Where is there agreement that we can dive into the weeds on to actually somehow move the needle? So let me ask you about this. Everyone has seen that video of George Floyd. It's horrific. Is there any consensus that you, a conservative lawmaker in Kentucky, could you see yourself working with any Democrats? Is there any type of policy that could come out of Washington, or do you see this as to prevent this type of thing from ever happening again, or is this a local issue?
No, I don't think it's a local issue. I think it's a national issue, and yes, I think there is an opportunity for bipartisanship on this issue, because what happened to George Floyd was a horrific tragedy. This kind of police misconduct should never happen. There's bipartisan agreement about that. I think many members of Congress and Americans recognize that this kind of police misconduct is rare, that the vast majority of law enforcement officers are good, civic-minded people who live up to the high standards that we impose upon them.
Right.
But one of these horrific events is one too many. And let's face it, there have been several of these. Breonna Taylor's case is tragic right here in Louisville, Kentucky, and then of course the Floyd case is the one that really has spurred a lot of these protests. And we're glad to see that most of these protests are peaceful. But we want to also recognize that violent protests and riots do not help the situation, and they dishonor the memory of George Floyd. So I do think there's an opportunity to unite and heal as a country, come together, and root out racial discrimination in police and law enforcement agencies around this country, which should never be tolerated. We have to recognize that there is injustice with this.
Yeah.
And so let's not engage in serious proposals like defunding the police, but actually fund them to reform them.
All right, we got to leave it there. Andy Barr, thank you. Thank you very much. More next. This is 99.1 Bloomberg.